It was a Friday evening in early March 1959. A 9-year-old girl named Candace Rogers, everyone called her Candy, walked out of the apartment where she lived with her family above a neighborhood grocery store in west central Spokane, Washington. She had 7 boxes of campfire mints tucked under her arm. She was going door to door, selling to neighbors, raising money for her troop. She kept her route close to home, to the streets she knew, to the faces she recognized. There was no reason to go far. Everything she needed was right there, within a few blocks of her own front door. She was 9 years old. The evening was ordinary. She left, and she did not come back. Within a few hours, her family realized something was wrong. They went looking for her themselves first, the way families do when worry hasn't yet become fear, when they still believe she must have stopped somewhere, must have lost track of time, must be just around the next corner. Then the neighbors joined in, then the police, and by the time they worked their way toward the Fort George Wright Bridge that evening, what they found stopped them cold. The mint boxes, abandoned on the ground near the bridge, scattered as though she had simply set them down and walked away. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no witness who had seen anything. Just 7 boxes of campfire mints and the dark Spokane evening pressing in around them. No trace of Candy Rogers anywhere. What followed was unlike anything Spokane had ever seen. Over the next 16 days, more than 1,200 volunteers mobilized across the city. They fanned out across fields and riverbanks, through back roads and tree lines, through the kind of terrain that swallows things and gives nothing back. A military helicopter from a nearby base joined the aerial search. On the very first day of the effort, it struck a set of high-tension power lines above the Spokane River. It went down. 3 Air Force airmen died in that crash. Marlis D. Ray, William A. McDonnell, Kenneth G. Fautek, 3 men who had come out to look for a missing 9-year-old girl and never went home either. The city was searching for one child and losing grown men in the effort, and still the answer did not come. 16 days passed. On March 21, 1959, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base who had gone out hunting off Old Trails Road, northwest of Spokane, found something in the brush, a pair of small shoes. They searched the ground around them, and beneath a shallow layer of pine needles and broken tree boughs, 7 miles from her front door, they found Candy Rogers. She had been raped. She had been strangled. The strips of fabric used to bind her feet and tighten around her throat had been cut from the clothing she was wearing when she left home that Friday evening with her 7 boxes of mints. She was 9 years old. The man who did this walked away from those woods and went on with his life. And for the next 62 years, no one in the world knew his name. The clothing she had been wearing that night went into an evidence room in Spokane. It would sit there for 6 decades, holding a secret the rest of the world hadn't yet found a way to read. This case sat unsolved for 62 years. Subscribe and hit the bell because the way it was finally cracked is unlike anything you have seen before. Candy Rogers was a 4th grader at Holmes Elementary School, a bluebird in the Campfire Girls program, and a kid who knew her neighborhood the way kids that age know the places they belong to. Every house, every face, every front porch, and every name attached to it. She lived above a grocery store with her family in west central Spokane. She had a dog she loved. She had a troop she was proud of. She also had a big sister, not a biological sister, a campfire big sister, a 10-year-old girl from the same neighborhood, assigned to walk alongside her through the program, to look out for the younger one. Hold on to that because it matters more than it seems to right now. What happened on the evening of March 6, 1959 did not stay inside Candy's family. It moved through the entire city of Spokane the way a cold front moves. You feel it before you can explain it. And when it passes, the temperature has changed permanently. Before that Friday evening, children in west central Spokane moved through their neighborhood freely, on foot, door to door, block to block, without a second thought. Kids walked. Kids knocked on strangers' doors and asked them to buy things for the school or the troop or the team. Kids came home when they were supposed to, and parents trusted the neighborhood to hold them until they did. After that Friday evening, they didn't anymore. A single act committed by a single man on a single street rewrote the unspoken contract of an entire community. The Spokane that existed on the morning of March 6, 1959, was a different city than the one that woke up on March 7th. The man who made it different walked free for 62 years. The investigation that opened on the night of March 6th was the largest the Spokane Police Department had ever run, and it had almost nothing to work with. In 1959, there was no national sex offender registry, no centralized database of prior offenders, no system designed to flag men with histories of violence against women and children. DNA profiling did not exist. The concept would not emerge for another 3 decades. Forensic science in 1959 meant what you could see with your eyes, what you could lift from a surface, what a witness could describe from memory after the fact. Tips came in from across the city, then from across the state, then from across the country, hundreds of names, hundreds of sightings, hundreds of pieces of information from people who were certain they had seen something that might be the key. Investigators followed everyone, they ran down every name. They knocked on doors and drove across county lines and sat across tables from men who fit various descriptions and turned out to be entirely the wrong people. Every trail closed without probable cause, but they kept the evidence. Every year, the physical evidence from the night of March 6th was repackaged and preserved and carefully protected. The clothing she had been wearing, the same fabric that had been used to bind her and strangle her, sealed and placed in storage. Binders grew thick, names filled pages. The file on Candy Rogers got heavier with every passing year that produced no answer. Decades went by. And then, more than 40 years after the murder, the investigation made its first genuine breakthrough. Not because a new lead had come in, but because the science had changed around the evidence sitting in that storage room since 1959. From the clothing, forensic scientists were finally able to isolate something, a DNA profile. A partial genetic signature left behind by the man who had killed Candy Rogers, preserved in the fabric through 4 decades of storage, invisible to every technology that had preceded this one. They had something real, something that had been there the entire time, waiting in the dark. But a DNA profile without a name attached to it is a locked door with no key in sight. Investigators ran the profile against every available database and came back with nothing. No match, no hit. The man who had killed Candy Rogers had either never been entered into any qualifying database, or he existed entirely outside the reach of the systems designed to find people like him. The profile went back into the file, and it waited. Detective Brian Hammond kept waiting with it. Hammond had worked the Candy Rogers case for years, long enough to watch forensic technology transform around him, long enough to see the investigation evolve from paper tip sheets and witness sketches into DNA profiles and genealogical mapping. In 2007, he sat down with reporters and told them plainly that he believed DNA was going to solve this case. Not might, was going to. He worked it the following year, and the year after that, he worked it while Spokane changed around him, and while the people who had known Candy Rogers in 1959 grew old, and while the technology kept advancing without yet producing the match that would make it all mean something. He kept the file active, he kept the evidence intact, he kept the question from becoming one that anyone was allowed to stop asking. Brian Hammond worked the Candy Rogers case until the day he retired. That was in 2021, 62 years after a 9-year. Old girl left her apartment with 7 boxes of campfire mints and never came home. There was one name that kept returning to the top of the file, Hugh Bion Morse. Morse was a serial killer connected to at least 4 murders, including 2 women from Spokane. He had a documented history of violence against women. He had been in the area during the relevant period. He fit the time, he fit the geography. He fit the profile of the kind of man capable of what had been done to a 9-year-old girl on the evening of March 6, 1959. Investigators took him seriously for years. More seriously than anyone else the investigation had ever surfaced. Then the DNA results came back. He didn't match. No physical evidence connected Hugh Bion Morse to Candy Rogers. His name was crossed off and added to the long list of names that had looked, at various moments, like they might be the answer, and had turned out instead to be walls. The file stayed open, the evidence stayed in storage, the man responsible stayed unknown. By 2020, the Candy Rogers case was 61 years old. Investigators gathered the clothing from storage and sent it to a private forensic laboratory, a final push to extract something usable from evidence that had been sitting in boxes since 1959. If any usable biological material had survived 6 decades of time, this was the moment to find it. The lab examined what they had and sent it back. The DNA was too degraded. 61 years of time had accomplished what investigators had spent decades fighting against. The material that had once yielded a partial profile had deteriorated beyond what any available technology could reconstruct into something actionable. After 61 years of searching, thousands of tips, hundreds of names, one serial killer who fit every profile except the DNA, science itself, the thing Detective Hammond had staked his faith in, said no. It looked, for the first time in a very long time, like that was the end of the road. It wasn't. In 2021, Spokane police made one more call. They sent the clothing to a laboratory in Texas called Othram. Othram had built its entire practice around exactly the kind of problem that had defeated every other institution that had touched this case: degraded DNA, decades, old evidence, biological material that time had reduced to what everyone else had concluded was nothing. Where another laboratory had looked at what remained on that fabric and determined there was nothing left to use, Othram looked at the same material and reached a different conclusion. They went to work, and from what was left on that 62-year-old piece of clothing, they built a genealogical profile. Here is how forensic genealogy works. A traditional DNA database only produces a result if the exact person is already entered into the system. If the killer was never arrested for a qualifying offense, if he never submitted a DNA sample, he simply does not appear. The database cannot find someone who was never placed inside it. Forensic genealogy approaches the problem from a different direction entirely. Even if the killer never submitted his own DNA to any database, a relative might have a cousin, a second cousin, a distant family member who uploaded their results to an ancestry website years later, looking to learn where their family came from, with no knowledge whatsoever that somewhere in the branches of that family tree was a man who had killed a 9-year-old girl in 1959. Genealogists take those distant matches and begin building outward from them, branch by branch, generation by generation. They follow the genetic thread through the family tree until it leads them to the person at the center of it. That is what Othram did. They followed the thread. The thread led to 3 brothers, John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. One of these 3 men had killed Candy Rogers. The science was clear on that. What it could not yet determine on its own was which one. And when investigators began looking into the Hoff brothers, they hit a problem that briefly stopped everything cold. All 3 brothers were dead. The man who had walked away from those woods in 1959 had lived out his entire remaining life without being identified, without being questioned, without once being asked to account for what he had done, and now he was gone. All 3 possible answers were gone. The secret appeared to have died with them. It appeared that way. Investigators approached the Hoff family. What happened next was not something that could have been scripted or required or predicted. John Ray Hoff's daughter, a woman named Kathy, learned that her father was a suspect in the murder of Candy Rogers. She learned that investigators were working to determine which of 3 brothers was responsible, and that the answer might be reachable through the DNA of a living biological relative. She drove to the Spokane Police Department. She walked in voluntarily. She sat down and gave them her DNA. She did not know what the results would say about her father. She did not know what truth she was about to help uncover. She gave it anyway because she wanted the truth more than she wanted to be protected from it. The results came back on September 8, 2021. Forensic scientist Brittany Wright reviewed the comparison between Kathy's DNA and the profile recovered from Candy Rogers' clothing. The science returned a single number, 2.9 million. The DNA recovered from Candy Rogers was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to the suspect profile than to the general population. A number that left no room for interpretation, no space for reasonable doubt, no path toward any conclusion other than the one it demanded. The clothing had held that answer since 1959 through every dead end, through every wrong name, through a private lab that said there was nothing left, through 62 years of storage in boxes that detectives had repackaged and preserved and refused to discard. On September 23, 2021, investigators executed a search warrant on the grave of John Ray Hoff. The man who had been in the ground since 1970 was exhumed. His remains confirmed what Kathy's DNA had already made undeniable. John Ray Hoff had killed Candy Rogers. John Ray Hoff was 20 years old on the evening of March 6, 1959. He lived on West Broadway Avenue in Spokane, 1 mile from Candy Rogers' front door, 1 mile from the apartment above the grocery store where a 9-year-old girl had picked up 7 boxes of mints and walked out into a neighborhood she had every reason to believe was safe. He knew that neighborhood. He had grown up inside it. Hoff had a record, nothing that would have made him visible, nothing that would have triggered a flag when investigators swept the area in the days after the murder, a petty juvenile history. In 1959, that did not automatically generate scrutiny and did not land a young man in any centralized database because no such database existed. He was a 20-year-old with a minor history who lived 1 mile from where Candy Rogers had started her route. That was what no one knew. That was what should have mattered and didn't, because no one had any way to connect those two facts. In 1961, 2 years after Candy Rogers was murdered, John Ray Hoff was arrested again. He had tied up a woman and attempted to strangle her. The Army discharged him for it. He was convicted. And that conviction, an act of violence that bore a direct and undeniable resemblance to what had been done to a 9-year-old girl 2 years earlier, never once produced a connection to the Candy Rogers investigation. His name was not in the file. It had never been in the file. Through 62 years of tips and names and leads and dead ends, John Ray Hoff had not appeared a single time, not once. He was 1 mile away. He was entirely invisible. Now go back to what was said at the beginning. Candy Rogers had a campfire big sister, a 10-year-old girl from the neighborhood, assigned to look out for her, to walk alongside her through the program. That girl was the reason Candy was out that evening, selling mints for the troop, keeping close to home, doing what bluebirds did on a Friday evening in March. That 10-year-old girl was John Ray Hoff's sister. He did not stumble across Candy Rogers by accident. He did not select a stranger from the street at random. He knew exactly who she was. He knew her face. He knew where she lived. He knew she was in the Campfire Girls because his own younger sister was her big sister, because their families moved through the same small radius of West Central Spokane, because the neighborhood that Candy Rogers walked through that evening believing herself safe was the same neighborhood John Ray Hoff had always known. He chose her. John Ray Hoff did not live to see forensic genealogy. He did not live to see DNA profiling or the ancestry databases that would one day make it possible to trace a family tree from a degraded sample on a 62-year-old piece of fabric. He did not live to see a laboratory in Texas look at evidence another lab had given up on and decide there was still something there. In 1970, 11 years after he walked away from those woods off Old Trails Road, John Ray Hoff died by suicide. He was 31 years old. He took the answer with him. He had carried it for 11 years, and he must have believed, that the ground would keep it. The clothing he had used to bind the feet and crush the throat of a 9-year-old girl was sitting in an evidence room in Spokane. It had been there since 1959. It would remain there for another 51 years after he died, through the invention of DNA profiling, through the expansion of national databases, through the private lab that said no, and the Texas lab that said let us try, until the science finally reached far enough to pull his name back out of the dark. He thought he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. On November 19, 2021, the Spokane Police Department stood before the cameras and said the name out loud for the first time. John Ray Hoff, 62 years, after a 9-year-old girl left her apartment with 7 boxes of campfire mints and never came home, there was finally an answer. The case was, at the time of its resolution, one of the oldest cold cases ever solved in the state of Washington. Detective Zach Stormont stood at that press conference and called it the Mount Everest of their cold cases. The one that had loomed over the department for as long as anyone could remember. The one that every detective who had ever inherited the file understood was the case. The name that never stopped mattering, the question that had outlasted careers and technologies and 6 decades of dead ends. But nobody ever forgot. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom where John Ray Hoff was made to sit across from the family of the girl he had killed and hear the full weight of what he had done read aloud in public. He had been in the ground since 1970. The law had no reach left in his direction. Spokane Police Chief Craig Meidel did not soften it. He said the outcome was definitely more bitter than sweet. A 9-year-old girl had been kidnapped, violated, and murdered. The man responsible had lived 11 more years and died on his own terms. What the investigation had ultimately produced was a name. Only a name, the most important name in a file that had once held thousands of them, and the only one that had ever mattered. Candy's family had waited 62 years for that name. When it came, one family member said they thanked God they had lived long enough to hear it. They had carried the question through every year the tips dried up. Through every year the technology said not yet. Through every year it seemed possible the answer might simply never arrive. And when investigators finally gave them the name, the family said 4 words. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Not for a verdict, not for a sentence, for the truth. For the 62 years of detectives who kept the evidence intact and the file moving and the question open. For Brian Hammond, who worked it until the day he retired. For Kathy Hoff, who walked into a police station voluntarily and handed over her DNA without knowing what it would reveal about her father. For a laboratory in Texas that looked at fabric every other scientist had already given up on and said, "Let us try one more time." For everyone who refused to let Candy Rogers become a name that time quietly swallowed. The clothing she was wearing on the evening of March 6, 1959, sat in an evidence room in Spokane for 62 years. The strips cut from it, the ones used to bind her feet, the ones pulled tight around her throat, sat in that same room, in those same boxes, repackaged and preserved and protected by detectives who understood that what looked like nothing might one day become everything. They were right. The fabric held the answer from the night it happened. It survived the decades. It outlasted a private lab that declared it too degraded to read. It outlasted the man who had left it behind. And when the science finally grew large enough to read what was written inside it, the answer had been there the entire time, unchanged, intact, waiting. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She was a fourth grader at Holmes Elementary School. She was a blue bird in the Campfire Girls, and she had a big sister in the program who looked out for her. And she had a dog she loved, and she had a neighborhood she believed was safe, and she had 7 boxes of mints tucked under her arm on the last evening of her life. She deserved to come home. If this story stayed with you, share it. There are families still waiting for the call that Candy's family finally received after 62 years. Subscribe, leave a comment, and help make sure these names are not forgotten. Because justice, when it finally comes, always starts with someone who refused to look away.